Hi everyone, this week let's talk about scaffolding and how it fits into our planning, the difference between scaffolding and differentiation, and the whole idea that it's about building on. Let's go. Scaffolding. What is involved? Scaffolding is all about your unit planning, or just planning for that skill, planning to get that part of a task done or to get your students through it. So it's to do with your planning. Scaffolding is not differentiation. Differentiation is about giving students different work, harder work, easier work, depending on their skills. It's not about giving more work or less work, by the way, but that's a whole nother story. So we're talking about scaffolding, building on, and I guess the best analogy would be thinking about, I'm starting to teach my stepson to drive. So the first thing is he's not ready for his learners yet, but he is driving up and down my driveway, and he is learning how to steer the car, that feeling of steering a car. He's learning how to use the accelerator and the brake. And so that's that first step before he gets his learners and he's able to go out on the road, because I'm not going to be driving straight into a ditch once we get on the road. Okay, so that's stage two. I'm scaffolding him through that. So building a scaffold to get further up the building, okay, further up the structure. So that's what scaffolding is. Scaffolding is about having that clear goal in mind. This is where I want to get to. Scaffolding is then about breaking down breaking down the steps and putting them in the right order so that students do add on. Scaffolding is about watching your language, the language that you use, and keeping it consistent. We'll talk about that in a minute. Scaffolding is about the way you present the information, both in a visual sense and in the way you structure your lessons. And scaffolding is about building in little activities along the way so that they can cement that stage of the learning before moving on. So let's get into that. Scaffolding is about having your clear goal in mind, as I said. So that's stage one. Boom, tick the box. Number two is about sort of back planning, building the steps on, as I've said. Now let's look at a couple of examples about how that might work. So the first example I'm going to talk about is getting students to write a personal response to a text, and it's just a semi-formal, informal, doesn't have to have a conclusion, an introduction or a conclusion. We just want 3 paragraphs, because I want them to pick out 3 things that the students that stand out for the students, that rock their boat about that text and that they could talk about. But it's not just about saying, oh yeah, I really like that character because they had a cool costume and stuff. I mean, we want a bit more than that, right? So I get my little bit of paper. Why can I never do this? Get my little bit of paper and I just map it out. That's my planning, folks. Nothing fancy. And actually, to be honest, this is actually the first draft. I wrote it out nicely for you. So what have I broken it down to? I've broken it down into examples or exemplars. I like to write my own example because I have standards that I want students to follow. I'm going to show them that because then they can see what the end goal is. They know what I'm talking about. And then I will say, okay, we're going to break it down, do one step at a time so that you can reach this goal. So the first thing I'm going to take them through is what does a personal response look like, and I will talk about personal pronouns and what they are, might compare them to second and third. So I've written notes, further notes to just think about, okay, well, what might I cover in that? I'm going to talk about opinions, and I'm going to break that up by saying, we use a lot of adjectives when we talk about opinions, like this was a tragic event, this was a disheartening event, but negative, eh? Verbs, I believe, I feel, I imagined when I saw this. We could talk about opinions versus facts. but I probably wouldn't, to be honest. I just thought you might want to hear that in there. We could talk about how we can swish our opinions up with similes, metaphors, better vocabulary. Now, that might be something that I could differentiate with and maybe only take students through that as extension. So that little bit. So that's the differentiation, Hey, if you want to swish up your writing a bit more, go over to that corner of the classroom, because I've got some things about, figurative language and things that you could use. And over there's some thesauruses. If you want to push on with that, that's cool. All right. So that's a way of differentiating. So we've done personal pronouns, opinions, critical thinking would be the next thing. So that's about comparing it with other texts. So, Snow White, blah, 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 blah. She can be compared to Cinderella, or she reminds me of Cinderella because blah, 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 blah. We could talk about human behaviors, human nature, and how that might be reflected in a character, the events, people, the past, the present, the future, and talking about how, this is quite this reminds me of something I saw on the news last week. Please God, let them be watching the news, because this is happening at the moment. So this makes this book really relevant. Okay, so in the future, this suggests that our future is not looking too rosy. Gosh, what a depressing blog. I might go into hedging words. So, this illustrates one might think, although we want personal pronouns in with that. So now I'm thinking maybe it's not a good idea. But this suggests would be great. So I'd have to be really careful about what hedging words I introduce then. Okay, so you can see how thinking it out, breaking it down, makes a difference to how I present. And I'm thinking, hey, this is going to confuse students perhaps. And this won't. So it's just about choosing what you're going to cover very carefully. I might talk about paragraphs and what they are going to include. So obviously a topic sentence, and I don't care if we're talking about seniors here, because we need to reiterate these things all the time. I'm talking about evidence, also known as examples. I'm talking about when I look at evidence, I think, I've actually got to break that down. So there is evidence that aren't quotations, so we're just explaining or describing something from the text. And then there is evidence that includes quotations from the text. Okay, so if they're going to use quotations, break that down further. I've got to show them how to lead in or lead out from a quotation, blending it into their own sentence rather than just quote dumping. And I've got to show them how to punctuate. All right, so breaking it down, scaffolding them through. I've got to talk about how you are mingling thoughts and evidence. So sometimes, we use a T or a sexy paragraph or whatever. For this example, for this skill, I just want them to discuss quite freely. It's semi-formal, so I'm going to say to them, okay, so just mix in your evidence with your thoughts. Now, when I first planned this, I wrote down ideas, evidence, like this, and then I thought, no, I can't say ideas to the students, because then they'll think, we're talking about the main idea of the text. So you see how talking about thinking about language is really important. So that's actually my next point, is what's your language? So ideas or thoughts, what am I going to use? I have to be careful. Same thing with evidence, examples, quotations. What are you going to use and when? Which words you're going to use and when? And be very careful about how you're doing that, and be consistent with your language. So evidence is the same thing as examples in my book. That's the way I teach it. But some examples are just examples of something that happened in the text, and some examples are actual quotations. So direct examples, maybe you could say. So watching that language is the third part of scaffolding. The other part, and in line with all of this, of course, is presentation. Now, how are you going to break your lessons down? Are you going to do one skill per lesson? Are you going to do 2 skills and sometimes, or maybe 3 skills in a lesson? And then how are you going to say, okay, we've learned that skill, now we're going to move on to the next skill. How are you going to do that? Are you going to have something on your board? Are you going to have something on your slides? Maybe you could start the next skill with a karakia or a whakatauki that matches what you're doing or how you're all feeling about getting through this task. So when you break down your endpoint into those steps, make sure those steps are clearly marked. Now, when you're talking about a slideshow or perhaps a document that you're creating, be sure that your things like your headings and your subheadings are consistent. So I've seen some people, throw up some slides or give students a document, and it's not really clear that we're moving on to the next skill because this heading is the same as the subheading from the skill before. So are we starting a whole new skill? Should this be even a new title page to the slide or to the booklet? Do you know what I mean? So have them clearly, that demarcation is really important when you're scaffolding. So make sure the students know that they're moving on to the next skill. The next thing is an activity for each stage. So before you move on to that next stage, make sure you have an activity aligned so that students can show they've mastered that skill. And if they haven't, when you get them to do that activity, you have to mark it. You have to check it. Have they mastered that skill before you move on? Otherwise, then that's when you start losing your students in terms of engagement and in terms of being able to do something. Listen to me preaching. Fuck, don't work. Okay. My Wi-Fi's gone down, so I can't see what I'm doing. Hopefully this is still working. Let's talk about context shapes language. I keep saying language shapes context. Context shapes language. One of our achievement standards for this year for level 1, and breaking it down. Now, where's my book? Where's my book? Can't find my booklet. Here it is. Okay, so I have got, just pushing buttons here to try and get my thing going again so I can actually see on my screen what I'm showing you. Okay, here we go. So I print out all of the information that's online, and you've seen that it's in the freebie section. I've put it all together. So I go through these achievement criteria and the explanatory notes that break them down and go, okay, so what does that look like? So here it says here, describe the context. Okay, so in my notes that I've made, context, what? So background. So what is context? It's the background, political, historical. It's the audience, their experiences, their feelings at the time. It's about the creator, their experiences, their feelings, and their purpose. And then I would give examples to practice describing a context. And then we go into, so language features, that's the other thing that they've got to know about. So what are the language features? They need a list to refer to all the time, and it's got to be there and it's got to be printed out so they can be watching, looking, okay? Everything online is not going to work. They need that paper. They've got to have that text and be able to annotate it. Again, it's better printed out if they have their transcript of a speech. So I've got to think about that. It's part of my scaffolding. How am I going to do this? I'm actually going to print out that speech for them, and they are going to be able to annotate it. Okay, so now break it down again. What is annotation? So what tools are they going to need? And then what are they looking for? They're finding language examples or language features or examples that stand out to them. Now, I say finding, the standards say identifying. I can stand there and say to the kids, hey, you might read identifying somewhere. That's the same thing as finding, right? So we know what that word means. So we're acknowledging that language again. So it's like I said before, choosing your language is really important as part of that scaffolding, being really careful about your language. Okay, and then I want them to look into effects, and the effects on the audience. How does it make them feel? What's the acronym that I use? FETU. How does it make them feel? What emotions do they have? What does it make the audience think about? And what does it help them understand? Yeah, so the effects on the people. So I'm going to talk about that, and then I'm going to say, well, okay, so how does that relate to the purpose? So I've got this all mapped out here. So I look at the achievement standards. It doesn't matter if you're from another country, look at what you've got to do for that assessment, what students have got to do, and break it down into these skills. The next thing I want to do is looking at making connections. So how does it work well with another language feature? What does it suggest about human behaviour? What about the events and people in the wider world? What is reflected here? How does this language feature reflect the tikanga or the kawa of the situation? What ideas from Te Ao Māori are present here? For example, if you're looking at inclusive pronouns like we, where the speaker is talking about we, we should do this, blah, blah, blah. You can tie that into the importance of whanaungatanga. So there's plenty there to extend students' thinking and get them into that excellence category, get those fantastic grades. But they're not going to do it unless I break this down and scaffold them through. As you probably know, I love a good template because that's how my brain works. I certainly wasn't as a student great at just writing. Not that anyone ever gave me a template, but I find it easier to break things down using a template and just filling in the gaps. Then, okay, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that. So templates are great. You can use templates to as a crutch to help students through essays. So put this in this paragraph, put this in this paragraph, put this in this paragraph. These are the things you could write about for each paragraph. So that's that scaffolding them through. Let's recap. What is scaffolding? 5 things. Scaffolding is about having that clear goal in mind, what you're wanting to achieve by the end. Scaffolding is about breaking things down into clear, manageable, well-sequenced steps. I say breaking it down, but really, I guess if we're using that metaphorical scaffold, it's about building on, isn't it? So whatever you want to use. Scaffolding is about watching your language, making sure you are consistent with your language, making sure you are using the right words that aren't going to confuse. For example, I did not use ideas, blending ideas and evidence when I was talking about personal responses. I used thoughts because I didn't want students to get confused with the main idea of a text. I'm talking about their thoughts. So just choosing that language carefully. I'm talking about presentation. Scaffolding is about presentation, how you cue, how you signpost the next stage in those skills, both with when you present, how you present visually, and as part of your the way you start a lesson. The other thing, the fifth thing, of course, is about having an activity that shows students have mastered that skill, that stage, before you move on, or before you build on to the next stage. Hope that helps. Enjoy.